The painkillers made everything soft around the edges, but they couldn't blur the harsh lines of the legal documents spread across my coffee table like accusations I'd been avoiding for 3 days since Julian's lawyer hand-delivered them to my door while I was still walking with a cane still favoring my left leg where the airbag had crushed it against the dashboard in what felt like another lifetime but was really just 6 weeks ago. The car accident that changed everything, or maybe revealed everything that was already broken beneath the surface of our 12-year marriage. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The header read in Times New Roman like it was just another business document, not the systematic demolition of everything I'd built with the man I'd loved since I was 26 years old, fresh out of my CPA program and naive enough to believe that love conquered financial incompatibility, that passion could overcome the fact that Julian Ward had champion tastes and a working-class bank account, until my forensic accounting skills and my willingness to invest in his cybersecurity startup had given him the foundation he needed to build an empire. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd used my expertise in uncovering financial deception to help Julian create legitimate wealth, only to have him use that same wealth to abandon me when I was at my most vulnerable, physically broken and financially dependent after taking a leave of absence from my job to recover from injuries that should have killed me but instead just left me with chronic pain and a limp that might never fully heal. I was sitting in our living room, though I supposed it was just my living room now since Julian had moved out 2 weeks ago, claiming he needed space to process the trauma of almost losing me in the accident, but really using my recovery time to systematically remove his presence from our shared life the way you'd extract a splinter, working carefully to avoid leaving pieces behind that might cause infection later. The condo felt different without his energy filling the spaces between furniture, without his coffee cups leaving rings on my grandmother's antique side table, without his habit of leaving cabinet doors open just enough to catch the light wrong and cast shadows that made the kitchen feel smaller than it was. These details I'd complained about for years now seemed like evidence of a life that had been more real than the sterile perfection he'd left behind. Lena, my 11-year-old daughter, sat cross-legged on the carpet beside me, her dark hair falling across her face as she worked on homework with the focused intensity she'd inherited from me, the ability to disappear into numbers and logic. When emotions became too complicated to process directly, she'd been quieter than usual since her father moved out, asking careful questions that revealed how much she understood about the fractures in our family structure. "Mom, why did Dad take all his books but leave his coffee maker?" she asked without looking up from her math worksheet, and I realized she'd been cataloging the absences the way I'd been trained to notice discrepancies in financial records, the small inconsistencies that pointed to larger patterns of deception. "Maybe he forgot it," I said, though we both knew Julian never forgot anything, especially not the expensive espresso machine he'd imported from Italy and programmed to his exact specifications, the machine that had been his morning ritual for the past 5 years, the one thing that had remained constant even when everything else in our marriage had become negotiable. "Or maybe he left it on purpose," Lena said with the devastating insight that children possess when adults think they're not paying attention, "like leaving a piece of himself here so we'd have to think about him every morning when we make coffee." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw Julian's analytical mind paired with my instinct for reading people, a combination that would serve her well in life if it didn't make her too cynical too young. The way growing up with parents who dealt in facts and figures and the spaces between truth and lies had shaped my own understanding of human nature. Maybe I agreed, because honesty had always been the foundation of my relationship with Lena, even when that honesty revealed uncomfortable truths about the adults she depended on for stability and safety. Or maybe he just wanted to make sure we could still have good coffee. She smiled at that, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in weeks, and I felt something loosen in my chest, the tight knot of anxiety that had been my constant companion since the accident, since Julian's increasingly distant behavior, since the growing certainty that my husband was planning something I couldn't quite identify but could feel in the way he avoided eye contact when discussing our finances. The legal documents seemed to pulse with significance on the coffee table, demanding attention. I wasn't ready to give them, because reading them would make everything official, would transform my suspicions into facts that would require action. I wasn't sure I was strong enough to take while still recovering from injuries that had left me dependent on others for the first time in my adult life. But avoidance had never been my strong suit, and forensic accounting had taught me that the longer you waited to examine evidence, the more likely it was to be corrupted or disappear entirely. So I reached for the petition and began reading, reading, not just skimming the way I'd been doing for days, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Julian was seeking dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences, a phrase so generic it could mean anything from disagreement about household chores to fundamental incompatibility about life goals. But I knew Julian well enough to understand that he chose his words carefully. And irreconcilable differences was legal code for I've decided you're no longer useful to me, and I want to extract myself from this partnership with minimal financial loss. The property division section made my stomach clench with recognition of just how carefully Julian had been planning this move. Our joint checking account, which had held $43,000 the last time I'd checked, was listed as containing less than $8,000. Our savings account showed a balance of $1,200 when I knew it had held at least $25,000 just last month when I'd reviewed our statements during my recovery boredom. I reached for my laptop, ignoring the sharp protests from my ribs where they'd been cracked in the accident, and pulled up our online banking, trying to trace the missing money through transaction histories that told a story I should have been reading. All along, large transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, payments to vendors I'd never heard of, withdrawals that Julian had authorized while I was sedated in the hospital recovering from surgery to repair the damage to my spine. "Mom, you're doing that thing again," Lena said, looking up from her homework with the concerned expression she'd worn too often lately, the look that said she was worried about me in ways that 11-year-olds shouldn't have to worry about their parents. "What thing?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. The way I disappeared into financial data when I was stressed, the same way some people lost themselves in novels or television shows. I found comfort in the logical progression of numbers. The way debits and credits always balanced, the way every transaction left a trail that could be followed if you knew where to look. The detective thing where you stare at numbers and your face gets all concentrated like you're solving a puzzle, she said, and I realized she'd been watching me work from home during my recovery, had absorbed more about my professional process than I'd intended to share with her. "I guess I am trying to solve a puzzle," I admitted, because there was no point in lying to someone who'd inherited my ability to read people and situations. "But it's a boring, grown-up puzzle about money and paperwork. Nothing exciting, is it about, Dad?" she asked, and the directness of the question caught me off guard, because I'd been trying to protect her from the details of our financial situation the way parents protect children from adult concerns that might damage their sense of security. "Some of it," I said, carefully weighing how much truth an 11-year-old could handle. "Your dad and I are having some disagreements about how to divide our money and belongings now that we're getting divorced. Is he trying to cheat you?" she asked. And the matter-of-fact way she posed the question told me she'd been thinking about this longer than I'd realized, had been observing the dynamics between Julian and me with the same analytical skills I'd been using to examine our financial records. I looked at my daughter and saw myself at her age, already learning to read the spaces between what adults said and what they meant, already developing the instincts that would later serve me well in a career built on uncovering financial deception, and I wondered if I was doing her a disservice by shielding her from the truth about her father's character. "I don't know yet," I said finally, "but I'm going to find out." The next morning, I called my former colleague, Tasha Lynn, who'd left our accounting firm 2 years ago to start her own digital forensics consulting business, specializing in recovering financial data from compromised systems. The kind of work that required both technical expertise and the suspicious mind that made someone good at uncovering financial fraud. "Ava Moreno," Tasha's voice came through the phone, warm with genuine pleasure. "I heard about your accident. How are you healing?" Slowly, I said, settling into my desk chair with the careful movements that had become second nature since the accident. "But I'm calling because I need help with something that's not exactly medical, Julian problems," she said without hesitation. And I realized my marriage had been more transparent than I'd thought. If Tasha could read the situation from 3,000 miles away, where she'd relocated to start her business in Austin. "How did you know?" I asked, though I wasn't really surprised, because Tasha had always been able to read people and situations with the same precision she brought to analyzing compromised computer systems. "Because you're calling me instead of your lawyer, which means you suspect something that requires technical expertise to prove, and because Julian always struck me as the type who'd view a wife's serious injury as an opportunity rather than a crisis," she said, and the casual way she assessed my husband's character made me wonder what she'd observed during the years we'd worked together. He filed for divorce while I was in the hospital, I said, and heard Tasha's sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. And there's money missing from our accounts transactions. I can't explain payments to companies I've never heard of. How much money? She asked, and I could hear the shift in her voice from casual conversation to professional assessment. At least 60,000 from our joint accounts, maybe more. I'm still trying to trace everything, I said, pulling up the banking records I'd been analyzing. But Tasha, the timing is too perfect. He waited until I was incapacitated to make these moves. Send me everything, she said without hesitation. Account statements, transaction histories, copies of any business records you can access. I'll start with a preliminary analysis and we can go from there. I can't pay your usual rates, I said, because my pride required the acknowledgement, even though I suspected Tasha wouldn't let financial constraints prevent her from helping me. Don't insult me, she said with the dry humor that had made her my favorite colleague during our years working together. You trained me, remember? You taught me half of what I know about following money trails through digital systems. You taught yourself the other half, I said, because credit should be given where it was due, and Tasha had always been naturally gifted at understanding how people use technology to hide their financial activities. Email me everything by tonight, she said, and Ava, be careful about what you say to Julian until we know what we're dealing with. If he's been planning this for months, he might be monitoring your communications. The possibility that Julian had been spying on me added another layer of violation to an already devastating situation. But it also triggered the analytical part of my mind that had made me good at my job. The part that viewed deception as a puzzle to be solved rather than a personal attack to be endured. After hanging up with Tasha, I spent the rest of the day organizing financial documents, creating spreadsheets that tracked every suspicious transaction, and building a timeline that correlated Julian's unusual financial activity with my accident and subsequent hospitalization. The pattern that emerged was too precise to be coincidental. Julian had been systematically moving money out of our joint accounts for the past 3 months, but the pace had accelerated dramatically after my accident, when I was no longer able to monitor our finances with my usual attention to detail. He'd used my physical incapacity as cover for financial maneuvers that would have been impossible to hide if I'd been healthy and alert. The realization that my husband had viewed my suffering as an opportunity made me feel sick in a way that had nothing to do with my physical injuries, but it also activated something in me that had been dormant during my recovery, the part of my professional identity that thrived on uncovering truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. I was still working at my desk when Lena came home from school, her backpack hitting the floor with the particular thud that indicated she'd had a difficult day, the kind of day that 11-year-olds experience when their family structure is changing in ways they can't control or fully understand. How was school? I asked, looking up from the spreadsheet I'd been building to track Julian's suspicious payments to a company called Meridian Consulting Services that claimed to provide business advisory services but had no website, no physical address, and no employees that I could identify through standard business databases. Everyone keeps asking about Dad, she said, slumping into the chair across from my desk, about why he doesn't pick me up anymore, about why he didn't come to the parent-teacher conference last week. What do you tell them? I asked, because I'd been wondering how she was processing the changes in our family dynamic, whether she was old enough to understand the difference between parents who divorced because they grew apart and parents who divorced because one of them had been systematically deceiving the other. I tell them he's busy with work, she said with the diplomatic skills that suggested she'd inherited Julian's ability to manage information as well as my instinct for protecting people from uncomfortable truths. But Mrs. Henderson asked if everything was okay at home, and I didn't know what to say. You can tell her we're going through some changes, but that you're safe and loved, I said, because those were the only facts that mattered regardless of what else might be happening between Julian and me. And you can tell her that I'm working from home now, so I'm available if you need anything. Are you going to be okay? She asked, and the question was so direct, so mature, that it took me a moment to process the role reversal that had been gradually occurring since my accident, the way my daughter had been taking care of me emotionally while I focused on physical recovery. I'm going to be fine, I said with more confidence than I felt, but it might take some time to figure everything out because Dad took money that wasn't supposed to be his, she said, and I realized she'd been listening to more of my phone conversation with Tasha than I'd thought. Because relationships are complicated, I said, choosing my words carefully, and sometimes people make decisions that hurt the people they're supposed to love, like leaving someone when they're hurt, she said, and I saw that she'd been thinking about this longer than I'd realized, had been analyzing her father's behavior with the same critical eye she brought to everything else in her life. Like that, I agreed because there was no point in pretending that Julian's timing hadn't been deliberately cruel. That evening, after Lena had gone to bed, I sat in my living room surrounded by financial documents and felt the full weight of what I was facing, not just a divorce, but a systematic financial betrayal that had been planned and executed while I was vulnerable and trusting the man I'd loved enough to merge my life with his. But I also felt something else stirring beneath the hurt and anger, the same focused determination that had made me good at uncovering financial fraud in other people's lives, the recognition that Julian had made a critical error in his planning. He'd underestimated my ability to recover, not just physically, but professionally. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Nina Hartley's number, a divorce attorney who'd been recommended by my lawyer when I'd needed legal advice about a client's custody situation 2 years ago. Nina had a reputation for handling complex financial cases involving hidden assets and business valuations, the kind of work that required both legal expertise and investigative skills. Nina Hartley, her voice was crisp and professional even though I was calling after business hours. Miss Hartley, this is Ava Moreno. I'm calling about a divorce case that involves some complex financial issues, I said, choosing my words carefully, because I wasn't sure how much to reveal in an initial conversation. Are you the accountant who worked on the Brennan case? She asked, and I was surprised she remembered me from what had been a relatively minor consultation. Yes, I said, but this time I'm calling as a client, not an expert witness. I see, she said. And I could hear the shift in her tone from professional courtesy to focused attention. What kind of financial complexity are we talking about? Hidden assets, suspicious business transactions, money that's been moved systematically over the past few months, I said, ticking off the red flags that had been accumulating in my analysis. And a husband who timed his divorce filing with surgical precision. How much are we talking about? She asked. At least 60,000 that I can document so far, but I suspect there's more, I said, and I have reason to believe this has been planned for months, possibly longer. Are you available to meet tomorrow morning? She asked. I have an opening at 9. If you can make it to my office, I'll be there, I said, because the momentum I'd been building all day felt fragile and I didn't want to lose it by waiting. After hanging up, I sat in my living room looking at the legal documents Julian had served me and felt the first stirring of something that wasn't quite hope but wasn't despair either, the recognition that I had skills and resources and allies that Julian might not have anticipated when he'd planned his exit strategy. I thought about Tasha, working through the night to analyze the financial data I'd sent her about Nina Hartley, preparing to take on a case that would require both legal expertise and investigative persistence, about the spreadsheets and timelines and transaction histories that were already revealing patterns Julian had thought he'd hidden carefully enough to avoid detection. Julian had made one crucial miscalculation in his planning. He'd assumed that my physical injuries would make me passive and compliant, would transform me from a partner who might question his decisions into a victim who would accept whatever terms he offered, but he'd forgotten that my professional identity was built on asking the right questions and following the evidence wherever it led. The painkillers were wearing off, and I could feel the familiar ache in my ribs where they'd been cracked in the accident, the sharp protest from my spine where the surgeons had fused vertebrae to repair the damage. But I also felt something else, awakening the part of me that had been dormant during my recovery, the analytical mind that viewed deception as a challenge to be met rather than a defeat to be endured. I gathered the financial documents from my coffee table and carried them to my home office where I could spread them across my desk and begin the methodical process of building a case that would reveal not just what Julian had done but how he'd done it and why he'd thought he could get away with it. Tomorrow, I would meet with Nina Hartley and begin the legal process that would either recover what Julian had taken or reveal the full extent of his deception. But tonight, I had work to do, the kind of detailed financial analysis that required patience and precision and the willingness to follow every transaction, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Julian had been clever in his planning, but he'd made the mistake of underestimating his opponent, and in forensic accounting, that kind of overconfidence was usually the first step toward exposure, the thread that, when pulled carefully, would unravel everything. Nina Hartley's office occupied the top floor of a glass tower in downtown San Diego with views of the bay that spoke to the success she'd built representing clients in complex financial disputes. Her waiting room was decorated with understated elegance, the kind of professional environment that communicated competence without ostentation, the perfect setting for conversations about money and betrayal and the legal mechanisms available to people whose trust had been systematically violated. I arrived 15 minutes early, despite the morning stiffness that made walking longer distances more challenging than it had been before the accident, and used the extra time to review the documentation I'd organized the night before. Transaction histories that told a story of careful planning and deliberate deception, the kind of financial maneuvering that required both technical knowledge and complete disregard for the person being deceived. Mrs. Moreno Nina emerged from her office at exactly 9 o'clock, a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough human behavior to avoid being shocked by new variations on old themes. Please come in. Her office was larger than I'd expected, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a conference table that dominated one wall, surrounded by chairs that had clearly been chosen for long strategic discussions, the kind of furniture that suggested Nina was accustomed to cases that required extended analysis and careful planning. "I remember you from the Brennan consultation," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "You were thorough in your analysis and clear in your presentation, qualities that are unfortunately rare in expert witnesses." "Thank you," I said, though I was more interested in her assessment of my current situation than her professional memories. "I'm hoping those same qualities will serve me well as a client." "Tell me about your husband," she said, pulling out a legal pad and preparing to take notes. "And please start with the basics: marriage length, children, shared assets, the foundation we'll need to build on." 12 years married, one daughter, 11 years old, I said, reciting the facts that reduced a complex relationship to legal categories. "Julian owns a cybersecurity firm that I help finance in the early years. He's been the primary earner for the past 5 years while I've been working part-time and managing our household finances." "What changed?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "I was in a car accident 6 weeks ago," I said, touching my ribs reflexively where the ache had become a constant reminder of that day. "Serious injuries requiring surgery and extended recovery time." "Julian filed for divorce while I was in the hospital." "While you were hospitalized?" she repeated, and I could see her mental notes taking shape, the timeline that would become crucial in any legal proceedings. "And you mentioned missing money yesterday, at least $60,000 from our joint accounts," I said, pulling out the spreadsheets I'd prepared. "But the pattern suggests this has been planned for months. The transfers accelerated after my accident, but they didn't start then." Nina studied the documents I'd prepared, her expression growing more focused as she absorbed the scope of what Julian had orchestrated, the systematic nature of his planning that went far beyond opportunistic theft to something more calculated and deliberate. "This is sophisticated," she said after several minutes of silence. "The timing, the documentation, the way he structured these transactions to avoid triggering automatic alerts. Most people wouldn't have the knowledge to execute something this complex." "Julian's business involves financial security systems," I said. "He understands how banking protocols work, how to move money without attracting attention, and you understand how to follow money trails," she said, looking up from the documents. "Which puts you in a unique position to document what he's done." "I've been working on that," I said, though I realized I was only beginning to understand the full scope of Julian's planning. "But Nina, I think this goes deeper than just moving money from our joint accounts." "What do you mean?" she asked, and I could see her shift into the focused attention that had made her successful at handling complex cases. "Some of these payments are to companies I can't identify," I said, pointing to the spreadsheet I'd created. "Meridian Consulting Services, Blue Ridge Advisory Partners, entities that don't seem to exist outside of banking records, shell companies." She said immediately. "He's been moving money through fake businesses to make it harder to trace." "That's what I think," I said, "but if I'm right, this isn't just about hiding assets from me, it's about hiding income from the IRS." The words hung in the air between us, carrying implications that went far beyond divorce proceedings into territory that involved federal agencies and criminal rather than civil penalties. The kind of legal complexity that could transform a marriage dissolution into something much more serious. "We need to be very careful about how we proceed," Nina said after a long moment. "If Julian is committing tax fraud, the evidence we gather could be used in criminal proceedings, but it could also put you at risk if he realizes you're investigating." "He already knows I'm suspicious," I said, because there was no point in pretending Julian hadn't noticed my increased attention to our financial accounts. "But he doesn't know how much I've figured out." "Let's keep it that way," she said. "For now we proceed with the divorce as if it's a straightforward case, while we quietly build documentation of the financial irregularities." "How long will that take?" I asked, because the uncertainty was almost as difficult to endure as the betrayal itself. "Depends on what we find," she said. "But Ava, I want you to understand that if we're right about the scope of Julian's activities, this could take months or even years to fully resolve." "I have time," I said, though I wasn't sure I had the emotional energy to sustain an extended legal battle while still recovering from my physical injuries. And I have the skills to document whatever we find. We'll need more than documentation, she said. We'll need witnesses, people who can testify about Julian's business practices, financial experts who can explain his methods to a jury. If it comes to that, I know someone who might be able to help, I said, thinking of Tasha, who would be finishing her analysis of the data I'd sent her, a digital forensics expert who specializes in recovering financial information from compromised systems. Good, Nina said. But remember, we're building two cases simultaneously, the divorce proceedings and the investigation into Julian's business practices. They're related, but they have different timelines and different standards of proof. What do you need from me? I asked, because I wanted to understand my role in the process beyond being the injured party. Everything you can find about Julian's financial activities for the past 2 years, she said. And I mean everything. Bank statements, tax returns, business records, personal receipts, anything that shows how money moved through your household. I can do that, I said, though I realized it would require accessing financial records that Julian might have secured or removed from our shared systems. Be careful, she said, and document everything you find, but don't confront Julian about what you're discovering. We want him to think you're focused on emotional recovery, not financial investigation. He's not stupid, I said. He'll realize eventually that I'm examining our finances. Eventually, she agreed, but the longer we can delay that realization, the more evidence we can gather before he starts covering his tracks. I left Nina's office with a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt since before the accident, the recognition that I had both legal representation and a clear strategy for uncovering the truth about Julian's activities. But I also felt the weight of what I was undertaking, the complexity of building a case that might ultimately involve federal agencies and criminal penalties. The drive home gave me time to think about the implications of what Nina had outlined, the months or years of legal proceedings that would dominate my life while I was still recovering from injuries that affected my stamina and concentration. The challenge of maintaining secrecy while conducting an investigation that would require accessing records Julian might be protecting. But I also felt something else, the return of professional confidence that had been absent during my recovery, the reminder that I had skills and experience that Julian might not have anticipated when he'd planned his exit strategy, the possibility that his careful planning had included a crucial blind spot about my ability to recover, not just physically, but professionally. Tasha called while I was still driving home, her voice crackling through the Bluetooth connection with the excitement that indicated she'd found something significant in her analysis of the financial data I'd sent her. Ava, where are you? She said, without preamble, because we need to talk about what I found, and it's not the kind of conversation you want to have on a phone. I'm driving home from my lawyer's office, I said. Can you give me a preview? Your husband is either brilliant or completely reckless, she said, and I'm not sure which possibility is more dangerous for you. What did you find? I asked, though I was already pulling into my driveway and preparing to continue the conversation inside, where I could take notes and ask follow-up questions. 3 shell companies that I can identify so far, she said, and financial activity that suggests he's been planning this for at least 18 months, not just the past few months. 18 months, I repeated, because that timeline pushed Julian's planning back to a period when our marriage had seemed stable, when I'd had no reason to suspect he was preparing to leave me. Maybe longer, she said, but 18 months is as far back as I can trace with the data you sent me. If you can get me access to older records, I might be able to extend that timeline. How much money are we talking about? I asked, because the scope of Julian's deception was expanding beyond what I'd imagined possible. At least $300,000, she said, and that's just what I can identify from the records you provided. There could be more if he's been using other accounts or other methods to move money. The number hit me like a physical blow, because it represented not just the missing money from our joint accounts, but a systematic theft of assets that should have been shared between us, the product of years of joint financial planning that Julian had been secretly undermining. Tasha, can you trace where the money went? I asked, because recovery would require understanding not just what Julian had taken, but where he'd hidden it. Some of it, she said. But he's been clever about using multiple transfers and shell companies to obscure the trail. It's going to take time to map everything. How much time? I asked, because I was beginning to understand that this investigation would dominate my life for the foreseeable future. Weeks, maybe months, she said. But Ava, there's something else you need to know about the shell companies Julian created. What? I asked, though I was already bracing myself for another revelation about the scope of my husband's deception. They're Not just hiding assets, she said, they're claiming business expenses that don't exist, fake employees consulting fees for services that were never provided. It's not just asset concealment, it's tax fraud. How sure are you? I asked, because tax fraud carried federal penalties that would transform this situation from a divorce case into something much more serious. 90%, she said. But I'd want to do more analysis before making that assessment in court. Can you come to San Diego? I asked, because the complexity of what she'd found required face-to-face discussion and planning. I can be there tomorrow, she said, but Ava, you need to understand that what I found puts you in a difficult position. If Julian realizes you're investigating his business practices, he might view you as a threat to what? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. To his freedom, she said, because if the IRS gets interested in his shell companies and fake business expenses, he's looking at potential criminal charges, not just civil penalties. After hanging up, I sat in my car in my own driveway, trying to process the magnitude of what Tasha had discovered, the transformation of my personal betrayal into something that involved federal agencies and criminal penalties, the recognition that Julian's planning had been far more extensive and far more dangerous than I'd imagined. But I also felt something else, the return of the analytical clarity that had made me good at my job, the ability to view complex financial situations as puzzles to be solved rather than problems to be endured, the professional satisfaction that came from uncovering truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. I thought about Nina's advice about proceeding carefully while building documentation, about the months of investigation that lay ahead, about the challenge of maintaining secrecy while conducting an analysis that would require accessing records Julian might be protecting. But I also thought about the $300,000 that Julian had stolen from our joint future, about the 18 months of planning that had occurred while I'd been trusting him to manage our financial partnership, about the fake employees and consulting fees that suggested he'd been defrauding not just me but the federal government. The scope of Julian's deception was larger than I'd imagined, but it was also more vulnerable to exposure because tax fraud left paper trails that could be followed by people with the right skills and the right motivation. And I had both, plus something. Julian might not have anticipated the professional network to conduct an investigation that would reveal everything he'd been trying to hide. I got out of my car and walked into my house, where Lena was waiting for me with homework questions and normal 11-year-old concerns about friends and school and the ordinary complexities of growing up. The reminder that whatever else was happening in my life, I was still a mother responsible for protecting my daughter from adult concerns while preparing her for the reality that her father was not the person either of us had believed him to be. How was your meeting? She asked, looking up from her math homework with the careful attention that suggested she was learning to read my moods and reactions. Productive, I said, choosing my words carefully. But complicated. Is Dad in trouble? She asked, and the directness of the question reminded me that she'd been observing the situation longer than I'd realized. He might be, I said, because there was no point in lying to someone who would eventually learn the truth. But that's not something you need to worry about right now. But it's something you need to worry about, she said with the insight that continued to surprise me. It's something I need to understand, I said, so I can make good decisions about our future without Dad, she said, and I realized she'd already accepted the reality that our family structure was changing permanently, our future as a family of two, I said, which might be different from what we planned, but it's still going to be good. That evening, after Lena had gone to bed, I spread Tasha's preliminary findings across my dining room table and began the process of organizing the information into categories that would support the legal strategy. Nina and I were developing the documentation that would be necessary to prove not just that Julian had hidden assets, but that he'd committed federal crimes in the process. The shell companies had names that sounded legitimate: Meridian Consulting Services, Blue Ridge Advisory Partners, Summit Strategic Solutions. But they had no employees, no physical addresses, no business activities beyond receiving payments from Julian's cybersecurity firm and immediately transferring that money to accounts in Julian's name. The fake employees were even more brazen. Julian had created social security numbers for people who didn't exist, claimed business expenses for salaries that were never paid, submitted tax documents that reported income to individuals who were entirely fictional, the kind of systematic fraud that required not just technical knowledge, but complete disregard for legal and ethical boundaries. The consulting fees were the most sophisticated part of his scheme: payments to legitimate-sounding companies for services that were never provided, invoices that documented work that was never performed, business expenses that reduced his tax liability, while funneling money into accounts that I'd never known existed. The total amount of money Julian had stolen was staggering, but what struck me most was the duration of his planning, the 18 months of systematic deception that had occurred while I'd been trusting him to manage our joint financial future. While I'd been focused on recovering from my accident and managing our household. But Julian had made one crucial error in his planning. He'd assumed that my physical injuries would make me passive and compliant, would transform me from a partner who might question his decisions into a victim who would accept whatever terms he offered. But he'd forgotten that my professional identity was built on asking the right questions and following the evidence wherever it led. Tomorrow, Tasha would arrive with additional analysis and digital forensics expertise that would help us map the full scope of Julian's activities. Nina would begin the legal process that would either recover what Julian had stolen or expose him to criminal prosecution, and I would continue the methodical documentation that would support whatever legal strategy we decided to pursue. But tonight I had work to do. The kind of detailed financial analysis that had sustained me through years of complex cases. The recognition that Julian's overconfidence had created vulnerabilities in his planning that could be exploited by someone with the right skills and the right motivation. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and began creating a timeline that correlated Julian's suspicious financial activities with significant events in our marriage. The periods when I'd been traveling for work, when I'd been focused on managing Lena's school activities, when I'd been trusting him to handle our joint finances without my usual oversight. The pattern that emerged was disturbing but also illuminating. Julian had been most aggressive in his financial maneuvering during periods when I'd been distracted or absent, the times when he'd known I wouldn't be monitoring our accounts with my usual attention to detail. But he'd also been careless in ways that suggested he'd underestimated my ability to recover the evidence he'd thought he'd hidden carefully enough to avoid detection. The digital trails that Tasha was already following, the paper documentation that would support whatever legal action we decided to pursue. The irony wasn't lost on me that Julian had used my own professional skills to build his legitimate business success, only to underestimate those same skills when planning his betrayal. But overconfidence was a common characteristic among people who committed financial fraud. The belief that they were smarter than the people who might investigate their activities. I worked until after midnight organizing the evidence that would support our case, building the foundation for an investigation that would either recover what Julian had stolen or expose him to consequences he clearly hadn't anticipated when he'd planned his exit strategy. The physical exhaustion from my injuries made concentration difficult, but the mental clarity that came from having a clear purpose sustained me through the detailed analysis that would be necessary to prove not just what Julian had done but how he'd done it, and why he'd thought he could get away with it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new revelations, but tonight, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the accident. The return of professional confidence that had been dormant during my recovery. The reminder that I had skills and resources that Julian might not have anticipated when he'd planned his systematic betrayal of our marriage and our joint financial future. Tasha arrived at my house the next morning carrying 2 laptops and a determination that reminded me why I'd always considered her one of the most skilled investigators I'd ever worked with, the kind of person who viewed digital forensics as both technical challenge and moral imperative, the pursuit of truth through systematic analysis of electronic evidence. "Before we start," she said, settling into my dining room with the efficiency of someone accustomed to working in unfamiliar environments, "I need to ask you something that might sound paranoid, but given what I found yesterday, I think it's necessary." "What?" I asked, though I was already bracing myself for another revelation about the scope of Julian's planning. "Has Julian had access to your personal devices? Your laptop, your phone, your email accounts?" she said, pulling out a small device that looked like a sophisticated USB drive. "Because if he's been monitoring your communications, he'll know you're investigating." "He set up my home network," I said, feeling a chill as I realized the implications, "and he's had access to all my devices for years." "That's what I was afraid of," she said, connecting the device to my laptop. "This is going to scan for monitoring software, keystroke loggers, anything that might be sending your activity to another location." "You think he's been spying on me?" I asked, though the question felt naive given everything else I'd discovered about Julian's capacity for deception. "I think he's been planning this for 18 months, she said. "And people who plan financial fraud for that long usually take steps to monitor potential threats to their activities." The scan took 20 minutes, during which Tasha and I sat in Silence watching progress bars that would reveal whether my most private communications had been compromised, whether Julian had been reading my emails, monitoring my web browsing, tracking every keystroke that might indicate I was investigating his activities. You're clean, she said finally. No monitoring software, no keystroke loggers, no remote access tools. Why not? I asked, because the absence of surveillance seemed inconsistent with the sophisticated planning Julian had demonstrated in other aspects of his scheme. Either he's more arrogant than I thought, she said, or he installed monitoring software and removed it recently to avoid detection. Which do you think? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Arrogance, she said, because everything else about his planning suggests he underestimated your ability to investigate his activities. What did you find? I asked, because I was ready to understand the full scope of what Julian had been doing. Tasha opened her laptop and pulled up a complex flowchart that mapped Julian's financial activities across multiple accounts and shell companies. A visual representation of deception that was both sophisticated and ultimately traceable, if you knew where to look. 3 shell companies that I can confirm, she said, pointing to boxes on the flowchart, but probably more that I haven't identified yet. How many more? I asked, because the scope of Julian's activities seemed to expand with every new piece of evidence. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hard to say, she said, but the pattern suggests he's been creating new entities whenever he needs to move large amounts of money without triggering banking alerts. Show me, I said, because I needed to understand the technical details that would support any legal action we decided to pursue. Meridian Consulting Services was created 14 months ago, she said, highlighting one section of the flowchart. It received over $100,000 from Julian's business account and immediately transferred that money to a personal account in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands, I repeated, because offshore banking added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Blue Ridge Advisory Partners was created 8 months ago, she continued. It received $80,000 and transferred it to a Swiss account. And Summit Strategic Solutions, I asked, looking at the third company on the flowchart. Created 6 months ago, she said. Received $60,000 and transferred it to an account in Luxembourg. So he's been moving money offshore for over a year, I said, trying to process the implications of international banking regulations and foreign account reporting requirements, at least, she said. And Ava, there's something else you need to know about these offshore accounts. What? I asked, though I was beginning to understand that each new revelation would be worse than the last. Julian hasn't been reporting them to the IRS, she said, which means he's not just hiding money from you, he's hiding it from the federal government. Foreign bank account report violations, I said, because I was familiar with the legal requirements for disclosing offshore financial accounts. Exactly, she said. And the penalties for FBAR violations can be severe, especially when they're part of a pattern of tax evasion. How severe? I asked, because I needed to understand the full range of consequences Julian might face if his activities were exposed. Civil penalties can be 50% of the account balance per year, she said, and criminal penalties can include prison time. Prison time, I repeated, because the transformation of my personal betrayal into something that involved potential incarceration was still difficult to process. If the government can prove willful violation of FBAR requirements, she said, which seems likely given the sophistication of Julian's planning. What else did you find? I asked, because I sensed there were more revelations coming. Fake employees, she said, pulling up another section of the flowchart. At least 6 people who exist only on paper, but who've been receiving salaries and benefits from Julian's company. How is that possible? I asked. Because creating fake employees required social security numbers and tax documentation that should have been verified by multiple government agencies. Identity theft, she said. Julian has been using real social security numbers from people who died recently but whose deaths haven't been reported to the Social Security Administration yet. That's, I started to say, but the scope of Julian's criminal activity was becoming difficult to comprehend. Multiple federal crimes, she said. Identity theft, tax fraud, wire fraud, money laundering. The kind of charges that carry decades in prison. Decades, I repeated, because the man I'd been married to for 12 years was apparently capable of criminal activity that could result in a life sentence if he's convicted on all charges, she said. But Ava, there's something else we need to discuss. What now? I asked, because I wasn't sure I could absorb any more revelations about Julian's capacity for deception. Your legal exposure, she said, because some of these activities occurred while you were married to Julian and theoretically had access to his business records. You think I could be charged as an accomplice? I asked, because the possibility of criminal liability for activities I'd been unaware of was terrifying. I think you need to be very careful about how you proceed, she said, because the government might initially assume you were aware of Julian's activities, but I wasn't, I said, though I realize my word alone might not be sufficient to prove my innocence. I know that, she said, and the evidence supports that conclusion. But you'll need legal representation that specializes in federal criminal defense, not just divorce proceedings. Nina mentioned that possibility, I said, but I was hoping it wouldn't be necessary. It's necessary, she said, because if you're going to cooperate with a federal investigation, you need protection from potential prosecution. Cooperate with a federal investigation, I repeated, because the phrase suggested a level of involvement I hadn't anticipated. Ava, you have evidence of systematic tax fraud and money laundering, she said. The kind of evidence that federal prosecutors would be very interested in examining. You think I should report Julian to the IRS? I asked, because the decision to involve federal agencies would transform this situation from a private matter into something public and potentially dangerous. I think you should consider it, she said, because the evidence is strong enough to support criminal charges, and cooperation with federal prosecutors might be your best protection against potential liability. What would that involve? I asked, because I needed to understand the full implications of becoming a government witness. Providing documentation of Julian's activities, she said. Testifying about what you observed and when you observed it. Possibly wearing a wire, if they want to document admissions from Julian wearing a wire, I said, because the idea of secretly recording conversations with my estranged husband felt like a violation of whatever trust might remain between us. It's common in white-collar crime cases, she said, and it might be necessary to prove intent and knowledge. I need to think about this, I said, because the decision to become a federal witness would affect not just my legal situation, but my safety and my daughter's security. You should, she said. But Ava, you also need to understand that Julian's activities are escalating. What do you mean? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. He's been moving money more aggressively since your accident, she said, and some of his recent transfers suggest he's preparing to leave the country. Leave the country, I repeated, because the possibility of Julian fleeing had implications for both asset recovery and criminal prosecution. He's been converting assets to cryptocurrency, she said, and he's been researching countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States. How do you know that? I asked, because the level of detail in Tasha's analysis suggested she'd been able to access information beyond what I'd provided. His laptop, she said. The one he left in your home office when he moved out, you were able to access it? I asked, because I'd assumed Julian would have secured any devices that contained sensitive information. He wiped the hard drive, she said, but he didn't understand that wiping doesn't actually delete data. It just marks the storage space as available for new files. So you recovered the deleted files, I said, feeling a surge of professional satisfaction at the technical expertise that had outsmarted Julian's attempts at security. Most of them, she said, including his research on cryptocurrency exchanges in countries with favorable banking privacy laws. What else did you find? I asked, because I sensed there were more revelations coming. Email, correspondence with lawyers in the Cayman Islands, she said, and with banks in Switzerland and Luxembourg. Recent correspondence, I asked, because the timeline would be crucial for any legal proceedings. Within the past month, she said, including discussions about establishing residency in countries that don't cooperate with us. Tax enforcement he's planning to run, I said, because the evidence was pointing to a conclusion that would make asset recovery much more difficult. He's planning to disappear, she said, and if he succeeds, you'll never recover the money he's stolen unless, I said, because I could see the logic of Tasha's suggestion about federal cooperation, unless federal prosecutors freeze his accounts before he can transfer everything offshore, she said, which requires moving quickly. How quickly? I asked, because the timeline for action was apparently much shorter than I'd anticipated. Days, not weeks, she said, because once Julian realizes you're investigating his activities, he'll accelerate his exit strategy. Does he know? I asked, because the question of whether Julian suspected my investigation would determine how much time we had to act. Not yet, she said, but he'll figure it out soon, especially if you start asking questions about his business activities. What do you recommend? I asked, because I needed professional advice about how to proceed. Contact federal authorities immediately. she said, and provide them with everything we've found. What about the divorce proceedings? I asked, because Nina had advised proceeding carefully with the civil case. The divorce becomes secondary, she said, because if Julian is convicted of federal crimes, the asset division will be handled by federal prosecutors, not family court. And if he's not convicted, I asked because I needed to understand all possible outcomes. Then you'll still have the evidence to support your divorce case, she said. But, Ava, the evidence is strong enough that conviction is likely if prosecutors decide to pursue charges. What are the risks? I asked. Because becoming a federal witness would involve personal danger as well as legal complexity. Julian might view you as a threat, she said, and people who've committed the kind of crimes we're documenting sometimes take desperate measures to protect themselves. You think he'd hurt me? I asked, though I realized I didn't know Julian well enough anymore to predict his behavior under pressure. I think he's already demonstrated that he's capable of causing you significant harm, she said. And financial desperation can escalate into physical violence. What about Lena? I asked because my daughter's safety was more important than any other consideration. She's probably safe as long as Julian thinks he can still manipulate you, she said. But if he realizes you're working with federal authorities, that calculation might change. So I need protection, I said, because the implications of Tasha's analysis were becoming clear. You need legal representation, and you need to be careful about your personal security, she said. But Ava, you also need to act quickly because the window for freezing Julian's assets is closing today. I asked because the timeline was apparently much more urgent than I'd understood. Today, she said, because every day you wait gives Julian more time to move money beyond the reach of us prosecutors. I looked at the flowchart Tasha had created, the visual representation of Julian's systematic betrayal that was both personally devastating and professionally fascinating. The kind of complex financial crime that required technical expertise and complete disregard for legal and ethical boundaries. But I also looked at my daughter's homework on the counter. The reminder that whatever decision I made would affect not just my legal situation, but Lena's security and stability. The recognition that becoming a federal witness would transform our lives in ways that might be permanent and potentially dangerous. I need to call Nina, I said, because I wasn't prepared to make this decision without legal advice. Call her, Tasha said, but remember that time is working against us and Julian doesn't know we're investigating, I said, because I needed to confirm that we still had the element of surprise. Not yet, she said. But that advantage won't last much longer. I picked up my phone and dialed Nina's number, while Tasha continued analyzing the data she'd recovered from Julian's laptop. The digital evidence that would either send my estranged husband to prison or give him the head start he needed to disappear forever with the money he'd stolen from our joint future. Nina Hartley, her voice was crisp and professional even though I was calling outside of normal business hours. Nina, it's Ava Moreno, I said, and I need to see you immediately. What's happened? She asked, and I could hear the shift in her tone from routine professional courtesy to focused attention. We found evidence of federal crimes, I said, and my forensics expert thinks we need to contact federal authorities today. How serious? She asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Tax fraud, money laundering, identity theft, I said, and evidence that Julian is planning to flee the country. I'll meet you at my office in an hour, she said, and Ava, bring everything you have. Everything, I repeated, because the scope of documentation was extensive. Everything, she said, because if we're going to federal authorities, we need to be prepared for them to take this case seriously. After hanging up, I looked at Tasha, who was still working on Julian's laptop, her expression focused and determined. The kind of professional concentration that had made her one of the best digital forensics experts I'd ever worked with. What else are you finding? I asked because I sensed there were more revelations coming. Julian's exit strategy, she said. And it's more sophisticated than I thought. Show me, I said, because I needed to understand the full scope of what we were dealing with. He's been planning this for 2 years, she said. Not 18 months, 2 years, I repeated, because the timeline pushed Julian's planning back to a period when our marriage had seemed stable, when I'd had no reason to suspect he was preparing to betray me. And he's been working with accomplices, she said. People who helped him set up the shell companies and the offshore accounts. Who? I asked, because the involvement of accomplices suggested a level of sophistication I hadn't anticipated. I'm still trying to identify them, she said. But there are email exchanges with at least 3 other people who were involved in the planning, other people who might be charged. I asked because the scope of the criminal conspiracy was apparently larger than I'd imagined. Other people who might be willing to cooperate with federal prosecutors, she said, if they're offered plea deals, which means I said because I could see the implications of Tasha's analysis, which means you might not be the only witness, she said, and you might not be the most important witness, but I'm the one with the most evidence, I said, because my access to Julian's financial records was unique. You're the one with the most evidence and the most credibility, she said, because you're the victim, not an accomplice. What about the offshore accounts, I asked, because recovery of the stolen money was as important as criminal prosecution. Federal prosecutors can freeze them, she said, but only if they act quickly. How quickly, I asked, because the timeline for action was apparently measured in hours, not days. Today, she said, because Julian has been accelerating his transfers and he might complete his exit strategy within the next few days. We need to go to Nina's office, I said, because the decision to involve federal authorities required legal advice and strategic planning. We need to go now, she said, because every hour we delay gives Julian more time to disappear. I gathered the documentation. We'd prepared the flowcharts and transaction histories and digital evidence that would either send Julian to prison or give him the head start he needed to escape justice. But I also thought about Lena, who was at school unaware that her father was apparently a federal criminal who might be planning to flee the country. Tasha, what happens to Lena if Julian runs? I asked because my daughter's relationship with her father was complicated by factors she couldn't understand. She's probably safer if he runs, she said, because people who commit the kind of crimes we're documenting sometimes use their children as leverage. Leverage for what, I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. To keep their victims from cooperating with federal authorities, she said, or to negotiate better plea deals. You think he'd hurt her, I asked, because the possibility of Julian using Lena as a pawn was more terrifying than any other aspect of this situation. I think he's already demonstrated that he's willing to hurt people he's supposed to love, she said, and financial desperation can escalate into other kinds of violence. Then we need to move fast, I said, because protecting Lena was more important than recovering money or ensuring Julian faced consequences for his crimes. We need to move now, she said, because the window for both asset recovery and personal safety is closing. I looked around my dining room, where we'd spent the morning documenting Julian's systematic betrayal, the evidence that would either destroy him or give him the tools he needed to destroy us. And I felt the weight of decisions that would affect not just my legal situation, but my daughter's future and our physical safety. But I also felt something else. The return of professional confidence that had sustained me through years of complex investigations. The recognition that Julian's overconfidence had created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with the right skills and the right motivation. Julian had been planning this betrayal for 2 years, but he'd underestimated my ability to uncover his activities, and he'd overestimated his ability to disappear without consequences. The kind of miscalculation that had destroyed other criminals who'd thought they were smarter than the people investigating them. Let's go, I said, because the decision to involve federal authorities was really no decision at all given the scope of Julian's crimes and the timeline for his escape. Let's go, Tasha agreed, because it's time to turn the tables on Julian. I called Lena's school to arrange for her to stay with her friend Maya after classes while I met with Nina and prepared to transform my personal betrayal into a federal case that would either recover what Julian had stolen or ensure that he faced consequences for the systematic deception that had destroyed our marriage and threatened our future. The evidence was overwhelming, the timeline was urgent, and the stakes were higher than I'd imagined. But I also had something Julian apparently hadn't anticipated: professional skills and personal determination that would either bring him to justice or give him the fight of his life. The federal building downtown stood like a fortress of glass and steel against the San Diego skyline, its imposing structure a reminder that I was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. Nina sat beside me in the car, reviewing the documentation we'd prepared one final time before meeting with Agent Theo Rivera. Remember, she said, her voice carrying the focused intensity that had made her successful at handling complex financial cases. Be completely honest about everything you knew and when you knew it. Any inconsistencies could undermine your credibility. I understand, I said, though my hands were shaking slightly as I gathered the folders containing Julian's financial crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, but presenting it to federal authorities would transform my personal betrayal into a criminal case with consequences I couldn't fully predict. The security checkpoint inside the federal building was more extensive than I'd expected, with metal detectors and armed guards who examined our identification with the kind of scrutiny that emphasized the seriousness of what we were undertaking. Agent Rivera met us in the lobby, a man in his 40s with silver-streaked hair and the calm intensity of someone who'd spent years investigating sophisticated financial crimes. "Miss Moreno," he said, extending his hand with a grip that was firm, but not aggressive. "I understand you've uncovered evidence of systematic tax fraud." "I've uncovered evidence of systematic deception," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Whether that constitutes federal crimes is for you to determine." His office was smaller than I'd expected, with walls covered by organizational charts and financial flowcharts that suggested he specialized in cases involving complex business structures. He gestured for us to sit at a conference table that was clearly designed for reviewing documents and conducting detailed interviews. "Before we begin," Agent Rivera said, "I need to advise you that this conversation is part of a federal investigation, and anything you say might be used as evidence in criminal proceedings." "I understand," I said, though the formal warning made the reality of my situation more concrete. "Tell me about your marriage," Agent Rivera said, "and about when you first suspected your husband was engaging in financial deception." I began with the car accident, explaining how Julian had filed for divorce while I was hospitalized, how I'd discovered missing money from our joint accounts during my recovery. Agent Rivera listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad with the methodical precision of someone building a case. "You're a forensic accountant," he said. "When did your professional instincts tell you this was more than marital asset concealment?" "When I found payments to companies that didn't exist," I said. "Meridian Consulting Services, Blue Ridge Advisory Partners, Summit Strategic Solutions. Each had received substantial payments from Julian's business, but none had employees, physical addresses, or legitimate business activities." "Show me," Agent Rivera said. Tasha opened her laptop and displayed the flowcharts she'd created, visual representations of Julian's financial crimes that mapped money flowing through shell companies to offshore accounts. Agent Rivera studied the diagrams with the focused attention of someone who understood the significance of what he was seeing. "This is sophisticated," he said after several minutes. "The timing, the documentation, the way he structured these transactions to avoid triggering banking alerts. Most people wouldn't have the technical knowledge to execute something this complex. Julian's business involves cybersecurity and financial systems," I said. "He understands how banking protocols work, how to move money without attracting attention, and you understand how to follow money trails," Agent Rivera said, "which puts you in a unique position to document what he's done." "I've been working on that," I said, though I realized I was only beginning to understand the full scope of Julian's planning. "Miss Moreno," Agent Rivera said, "based on what you've shown me, I believe your husband has committed multiple federal crimes. Tax fraud, money laundering, wire fraud, and possibly conspiracy if he's been working with accomplices." "Accomplices?" I asked. "Financial crimes of this sophistication usually involve multiple people," Agent Rivera said. "Lawyers, accountants, financial advisors who help structure the transactions and manage the offshore accounts." "What does that mean for me?" I asked. "It means you might not be the only witness if we decide to prosecute," Agent Rivera said. "But it also means this case could involve additional defendants and take longer to resolve." "How much longer?" I asked. "That depends on how quickly we can act," Agent Rivera said. "Miss Moreno, based on the evidence you've provided, I believe we need to move immediately to prevent your husband from fleeing the country." "Fleeing?" I asked, though I'd suspected this was Julian's plan. "Tasha's analysis shows he's been researching cryptocurrency exchanges in countries without extradition treaties," Agent Rivera said. "Combined with his recent asset liquidation, the evidence suggests he's preparing to disappear." "How quickly can you move?" I asked. "If you're willing to cooperate fully, we can seek emergency court orders within hours," Agent Rivera said. "Asset freezes, travel restrictions, and potentially an arrest warrant." "What does cooperation involve?" I asked. "Complete disclosure of everything you've discovered," Agent Rivera said. "Formal statements under oath, and potentially recording conversations if your husband contacts you." "Recording conversations?" I asked. "It's common in financial crimes cases," Agent Rivera said, "and it might be necessary to prove intent and knowledge if the case goes to trial." "What if he realizes I'm recording him?" I asked. "He won't realize if you're careful," Agent Rivera said. But Miss Moreno, I need you to understand that once we begin this process, your relationship with your husband will become permanently adversarial. It's already adversarial, I said. He stole from me while I was vulnerable in the hospital. Then, you're willing to cooperate? Agent Rivera asked. I'm willing to do whatever's necessary to ensure he faces consequences, I said. What about your personal safety? Agent Rivera asked. People facing federal charges sometimes become desperate. What kind of desperate? I asked. Intimidation, harassment, sometimes violence, Agent Rivera said. Which is why we provide security measures for witnesses in cases like this. What kind of security measures? I asked. Protection for you and your daughter until your husband is in custody, Agent Rivera said, and potentially longer if the case involves additional defendants. How long? I asked. Until all related cases are resolved, Agent Rivera said, which could be months or years. Years. I repeated. Complex financial crimes cases often take years to prosecute, Agent Rivera said. But Miss Moreno, the evidence you've provided is strong enough that conviction is likely. What happens to the money? I asked. Seized assets are typically returned to victims after conviction, Agent Rivera said, but the process can be complex. When international accounts are involved. How complex? I asked. Complex enough that full recovery might not be possible, Agent Rivera said, but we'll pursue every available option. What do you need from me? I asked. A formal statement documenting everything you've discovered, Agent Rivera said, and your commitment to testify if the case goes to trial. I can do that, I said. Are you sure? Agent Rivera asked. Because once we file for emergency court orders, there's no going back. I'm sure, I said, because the alternative was allowing Julian to escape with impunity. Then let's begin, Agent Rivera said. We have a lot of work to do. Agent Rivera called at 7 the next morning, his voice carrying the focused urgency that meant federal machinery was already in motion. I'd been awake since 5, unable to sleep through the anxiety of waiting for a decision that would determine whether Julian faced consequences or escaped to live comfortably on the money he'd stolen from our joint future. Miss Moreno, we're moving forward with the investigation, he said. I need you to meet me at the office at 9 o'clock to provide your formal statement. What's happened? I asked, because the early call suggested developments beyond what we'd discussed yesterday. We've been monitoring your husband's financial activities since our meeting yesterday, Agent Rivera said. He's accelerated his timeline. We need to act today. Accelerated how? I asked, though I was already getting dressed and preparing to leave. He's been converting assets to cryptocurrency and researching flights to countries without extradition treaties, Agent Rivera said. Based on his recent activities, we believe he's planning to flee within the next 24 to 48 hours. So we're out of time, I said. We're acting today, Agent Rivera said. But I need your formal cooperation to proceed with account freezes and potentially an arrest warrant. You have it, I said. 9 o'clock, Agent Rivera said. And Miss Moreno, bring your daughter to stay with family for the next few days. Once we move on your husband, the situation could become unpredictable. After hanging up, I called my mother to arrange for Lena to stay with her, then gathered the additional documentation Agent Rivera had requested. The morning felt surreal, charged with the kind of nervous energy that comes from making decisions that will change your life in ways you can't fully anticipate. Tasha arrived at my house at 8:15, carrying additional analysis she'd completed. Overnight, I've been tracking Julian's activities in real time, she said, setting up her laptop on my dining room table. He's been busy. How busy? I asked. He's liquidated another $75,000 in assets since yesterday, she said, pulling up screens showing Julian's frantic financial activity. And he's been researching cryptocurrency exchanges that specialize in privacy coins. Privacy coins? I asked. Cryptocurrency designed to be untraceable, she said. If he succeeds in converting his assets to privacy coins, recovering the money becomes exponentially more difficult. But not impossible, I asked. Not impossible, but much more complex, she said. Which is why Agent Rivera is moving so quickly. What else did you find? I asked. Julian's been in contact with someone who specializes in helping people disappear, she said, showing me encrypted email exchanges, false identities, fake documentation, the kind of services that people use when they're fleeing from law enforcement. Someone who helps criminals escape? I asked. Someone who helps people create New identities, she said, which could be legitimate in some circumstances, but combined with everything else, it suggests Julian is planning to disappear permanently. Forever? I asked. If he succeeds, she said. But federal authorities have resources for tracking people who try to disappear with stolen money. The drive to Agent Rivera's office gave me time to think about the magnitude of what I was undertaking. By the end of the day, Julian might be under arrest, and I would be irrevocably identified as the person who'd exposed his crimes. There would be no returning to the life I'd known before the accident, before the divorce, before I'd discovered the truth about the man I'd been married to for 12 years. Agent Rivera was waiting for us in his office, surrounded by additional agents and federal prosecutors who'd been brought in to handle the case. The room buzzed with the kind of focused energy that comes from preparing for a complex law enforcement operation. Miss Moreno, Agent Rivera said, I'd like you to meet Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, who will be prosecuting this case. Sarah Chen was a woman in her 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that had probably made her successful at handling complex financial crimes. She shook my hand with a firm grip and looked me directly in the eyes. Miss Moreno, she said, the evidence you've provided is substantial. We're prepared to seek emergency court orders this afternoon. What kind of orders? I asked. Asset freezes on all accounts associated with your husband's business and personal finances, Sarah Chen said. Travel restrictions preventing him from leaving the country, and an arrest warrant for tax fraud, money laundering, and wire fraud. When will you arrest him? I asked. As soon as the warrants are signed, Sarah Chen said, probably within the next 6 hours. What about my safety? I asked. Federal agents will provide security for you and your daughter until your husband is in custody, Sarah Chen said, and potentially longer if he makes bail. Will he make bail? I asked. We'll argue for detention without bail based on flight risk, Sarah Chen said. But judges sometimes grant bail in white-collar cases, even when the defendants pose a flight risk. What if he does make bail? I asked. Then we maintain security measures and monitor his activities closely, Sarah Chen said. But Miss Moreno, the evidence is strong enough that conviction is likely regardless of bail status, the formal statement took 3 hours, during which I detailed everything I'd discovered about Julian's financial activities. Agent Rivera and Sarah Chen asked detailed questions about the timeline, the methods Julian had used, and my knowledge of his business activities. Miss Moreno, Sarah Chen said after the court reporter had finished, based on your statement and the evidence you've provided, we're filing for emergency court orders this afternoon. What happens next? I asked. We wait for the judge to sign the orders, Sarah Chen said. Then we execute them. How long does that take? I asked. Hours, not days, Sarah Chen said. But once these orders are issued, your husband will know he's under federal investigation. What's his likely reaction? I asked. He'll probably try to accelerate his exit strategy, Sarah Chen said. Which is why we're also seeking an arrest warrant. What charges? I asked. Tax fraud, money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy, Sarah Chen said. The evidence supports all 4 charges. What kind of sentence is he looking at? I asked. If convicted on all charges, 20 to 30 years, Sarah Chen said. But that assumes he doesn't cooperate with our investigation. Cooperate how? I asked. By providing information about his accomplices and the methods they used, Sarah Chen said. Cooperation could reduce his sentence significantly. What kind of information? I asked. Names, methods, financial structures, Sarah Chen said. The kind of information that could lead to additional prosecutions of other people who helped him? I asked. Of other people who might be running similar schemes, Sarah Chen said. Financial crimes networks often involve multiple participants. How many people? I asked. We won't know until we begin the investigation, Sarah Chen said. But cases like this often expand beyond the original defendant. What does that mean? For me? I asked. It means you might be a witness in multiple cases, Sarah Chen said. But it also means you'll receive federal protection throughout the process. What kind of protection? I asked. Security measures, relocation assistance if necessary, and legal protection if anyone tries to intimidate you, Sarah Chen said. We take witness protection seriously. For how long? I asked. Until all related cases are resolved, Sarah Chen said. Which could be several years. Several years, I repeated, Complex financial crimes cases often take years to fully resolve, Sarah Chen said. But Miss Moreno, the cooperation you've provided is remarkable. What have I provided? I asked. Documentation of systematic financial crimes that might otherwise have gone undetected, Sarah Chen said. The kind of evidence that allows us to build strong cases against sophisticated criminals. I was just trying to understand what happened to my marriage, I said. You uncovered something much more significant, Sarah Chen said. And your cooperation is going to help us protect other potential victims. Other victims? I asked. Financial criminals often have multiple victims, Sarah Chen said. Your husband's cooperation might help us identify other people who've been defrauded. What happens to those people? I asked. If we can prove their losses, they might be entitled to restitution, Sarah Chen said. The money we seize from your husband could be used to compensate multiple victims, including me? I asked. Including you, Sarah Chen said. But you'll probably be the primary beneficiary, since you provided the evidence that made the case possible. What about my daughter? I asked. She'll be protected throughout the process, Sarah Chen said. And if your husband is convicted, she'll benefit from the asset recovery. What kind of assets? I asked. Everything we can seize that was obtained through criminal activity, Sarah Chen said, which appears to be substantial. How substantial? I asked. We're still calculating the total, Sarah Chen said. But based on your evidence, at least $300,000 in liquid assets, plus real estate and business interests. That's more than I expected. I said. Financial criminals often steal more than their victims realize, Sarah Chen said. Your husband's crimes appear to have been systematic and extensive. What happens now? I asked. Now we wait for the court orders, Sarah Chen said. And we prepare for your husband's arrest. The emergency court orders were granted at 4:30. That afternoon, Agent Rivera called with the news while I was helping Lena pack for her extended stay at my mother's house, trying to make the sudden disruption seem like an adventure rather than a crisis. All orders granted, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully navigated complex legal procedures. Your husband's accounts are frozen, his passport has been flagged, and we have an arrest warrant. When will you arrest him? I asked, stepping into the hallway so Lena wouldn't hear the conversation. Tomorrow morning at 6, Agent Rivera said. We want to arrest him before he has time to react to the frozen accounts. How long before he figures out his accounts are frozen? I asked. Hours, not days, Agent Rivera said. Which is why we're providing security tonight. What kind of security? I asked. Federal agents will monitor your mother's house and escort you to any locations you need to visit, Agent Rivera said. And, Miss Moreno, I need you to understand that once we arrest your husband, he'll know you're cooperating with federal authorities. What does that mean? I asked. It means he might try to contact you, Agent Rivera said. And if he does, we'll need you to record those conversations. How? I asked. We'll provide you with equipment, Agent Rivera said. But the important thing is that you never meet with him alone. What if he wants to see Lena? I asked. Any contact with your daughter will be supervised, Agent Rivera said. We can't risk him using her as leverage. Leverage for what? I asked. To convince you to stop cooperating, Agent Rivera said. People facing federal charges sometimes become desperate. Federal agents arrived at my mother's house at 7 o'clock. Two serious-looking people who introduced themselves as Agent Martinez and Agent Thompson. They were polite but professional, the kind of people who dealt with dangerous situations. As part of their regular duties, Miss Moreno, Agent Martinez said, we're here to ensure your safety until your husband is in custody. What does that involve? I asked. We'll be monitoring the house and the surrounding area, Agent Martinez said, and we'll escort you to any locations you need to visit. For how long? I asked. Until the immediate threat is neutralized, Agent Martinez said. Probably a few days. What about my daughter? I asked. She's protected as well, Agent Martinez said. But we recommend keeping her here until the situation stabilizes. What situation? My mother asked, because I hadn't told her the full scope of what was happening. Mom, Julian is about to be arrested for federal crimes. I said, federal crimes. She repeated, her voice carrying the shock of someone who'd always viewed Julian as a successful businessman. Tax fraud, money laundering, wire fraud, I said. He's been stealing money for years. How did you discover this? She asked. By investigating. The missing money from our accounts, I said. And by working with people who specialize in uncovering financial crimes, you're working with the FBI? She asked. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division, I said. And federal prosecutors. Is that dangerous? She asked. It could be, I said. Which is why we have protection. What about Lena? She asked. Lena's protected too, I said. But she needs to stay here until this is resolved. Is Dad really a criminal? Lena asked, because she'd been listening to the conversation despite our efforts to protect her from adult concerns. Dad broke some serious laws, I said. And now he has to face the consequences. Will he go to jail? She asked. He might, I said. For a long time. Will I still see him? She asked. I don't know, I said. That depends on what happens with his case. But I'll still live with you? She asked. You'll always live with me, I said. No matter what happens. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, listening to the sounds of federal agents patrolling my mother's house, and thinking about the magnitude of what I'd set in motion. In 6 hours, Julian would be arrested for federal crimes, and my life would change in ways I couldn't fully predict. But I also felt something else, the satisfaction of having fought back against systematic betrayal. Julian had underestimated my professional skills and my willingness to pursue justice, even when that pursuit involved personal risk. He'd made a crucial error in his planning. He'd assumed that my physical injuries would make me passive and compliant, would transform me from a partner who might question his decisions into a victim who would accept whatever terms he offered. But he'd forgotten that my professional identity was built on uncovering truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. Agent Rivera called at 5:30 in the morning, his voice carrying the focused energy of someone who'd been awake for hours preparing for a complex operation. Miss Moreno, we're executing the arrest warrant in 30 minutes, he said. I wanted to give you advance notice. Where are you arresting him? I asked. At his hotel, Agent Rivera said. He's been staying at the Grand Hyatt since he moved out of your house. Is that safe? I asked. We're prepared for various scenarios, Agent Rivera said. But Miss Moreno, I need you to understand that once we arrest your husband, he'll know you're cooperating with federal authorities. What's his likely reaction? I asked. He'll probably try to contact you, Agent Rivera said. And if he does, we need you to record those conversations. What if he becomes violent? I asked. He'll be in federal custody, Agent Rivera said. But we'll maintain security measures for you and your daughter. For how long? I asked. Until we assess the full scope of his criminal network, Agent Rivera said. Which could take weeks or months. Months, I repeated. Complex financial crimes. Cases often involve multiple defendants, Agent Rivera said. But Miss Moreno, you've provided us with exceptional evidence. What kind of evidence? I asked. The kind that allows us to build cases against sophisticated criminals, Agent Rivera said. Your cooperation is going to help us protect other potential victims. At 6:15, Agent Rivera called again. We have him in custody, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a successful operation. How did he react? I asked. He demanded to speak with his lawyer, Agent Rivera said, which is standard. But Miss Moreno, he also asked about you. What did he ask? I said. He wanted to know if you were the one who reported him to federal authorities, Agent Rivera said. We didn't confirm or deny, but he's going to figure it out. What does that mean for my safety? I asked. It means we maintain security measures until we assess his intentions, Agent Rivera said. But the immediate threat is reduced now that he's in custody. What happens next? I asked. Arraignment this afternoon, Agent Rivera said. Then we'll see whether he decides to cooperate or fight the charges. What if he cooperates? I asked. If he cooperates, he might provide information about other people involved in his activities, Agent Rivera said, which could lead to additional prosecutions. And if he fights? I asked. Then you'll be a key witness in a trial that could take months, Agent Rivera said. But we'll prepare you thoroughly for that possibility. What about bail? I asked. We'll argue for detention without bail based on flight risk, Agent Rivera said. But the judge will make that decision. What if he gets bail? I asked. Then, we maintain security measures and monitor his activities closely, Agent Rivera said. But Miss Moreno, the evidence is strong enough that conviction is likely regardless of bail status. I want to watch the arraignment, I said. I can arrange for you to observe from a secure location, Agent Rivera said. But you won't be required to testify today. I want to see his face when he realizes the full scope of the charges, I said. I understand, Agent Rivera said. This is about more than just financial recovery for you. This is about justice, I said, and about ensuring he can't do this to anyone else. Then we'll make sure you can observe the proceedings, Agent Rivera said, because what you've accomplished deserves to be witnessed. Julian's arraignment was held at 2 o'clock that afternoon in a federal courthouse that smelled of old wood and institutional disinfectant. I watched from a secure viewing area behind tinted glass, accompanied by Agent Rivera and a victim services coordinator who'd been assigned to help me navigate the federal court system. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with the formal atmosphere that comes from dealing with serious criminal charges. Julian sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller and more vulnerable than the confident businessman who'd filed for divorce. While I was recovering from surgery, his lawyer, Rebecca Chen, whispered urgently in his ear as the charges were read aloud by the court clerk. Tax fraud, money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy. Each charge carried years of potential prison time, and the cumulative effect was devastating. Your Honor, Rebecca Chen said when given the opportunity to speak, my client has strong ties to the community, operates a successful business, and poses no flight risk. We respectfully request release on his own recognizance. Your Honor, the federal prosecutor countered, the defendant has systematically liquidated assets, researched cryptocurrency exchanges and non-extradition countries, and has failed to report offshore accounts to federal authorities. He represents an extreme flight risk and should be detained pending trial. I watched Julian's face during this exchange, looking for signs of the man I'd been married to for 12 years. But all I saw was calculation. The same focused intensity he'd brought to building his business, now directed toward escaping the consequences of his crimes. The evidence of flight risk is substantial, the judge said, after reviewing the prosecution's filing. However, I'm willing to consider bail under strict conditions. What conditions, Your Honor? Rebecca Chen asked. Bail is set at $2 million, the judge said, with electronic monitoring, surrender of all passports, and prohibition from accessing any financial accounts pending resolution of asset forfeiture proceedings, $2 million. The number was staggering, but I realized Julian might have access to resources we hadn't discovered yet. The possibility of his release made my security situation more precarious. Can he make that bail? I asked Agent Rivera after the arraignment. We're monitoring all known accounts, he said. But people who commit financial crimes often have hidden resources. What if he does make bail? I asked. Then we maintain security measures and accelerate our investigation, Agent Rivera said. But Miss Moreno, the arraignment has sent a clear message that he's under serious federal investigation. What kind of message? I asked. That anyone who's been helping him might want to consider cooperating with federal authorities, Agent Rivera said. Financial crimes networks often collapse when key players are arrested. You think his accomplices will cooperate? I asked. We're already receiving calls from people who want to discuss their involvement, Agent Rivera said. The arraignment has made cooperation more attractive than resistance. What kind of people? I asked. Business associates, financial advisors, people who help set up the shell companies, Agent Rivera said. The kind of people who face their own criminal liability if they don't cooperate. How many people? I asked. At least 3 that we know of, Agent Rivera said. Possibly more as the investigation continues. What does that mean for me? I asked. It means you might not be the only witness, Agent Rivera said, which could reduce the pressure on you personally. But I'm still a key witness. I asked. You're still the person who uncovered the scheme, Agent Rivera said, but you might not be the only person testifying about Julian's activities. That evening, while Lena was doing homework and my mother was preparing dinner, Rebecca Chen called Nina to request a meeting. The timing suggested Julian was beginning to understand the seriousness of his situation. What does she want? I asked. Nina, during our phone conversation, she wants to discuss the divorce proceedings in light of the criminal charges, Nina said, which suggests Julian realizes his legal situation has changed dramatically. Changed how? I asked. Frozen assets can't be divided, Nina said, and convicted criminals typically forfeit proceeds from their crimes, so if he's convicted, I get the money back? I asked. You get whatever the government doesn't seize. Nina said, which could be substantial, depending on how the case resolves. What if he's not convicted? I asked. Then we proceed with the divorce as originally planned, Nina said. But the evidence you've gathered makes conviction likely. What does Rebecca Chen want to discuss? I asked. Probably a plea agreement, Nina said. Criminal defense attorneys often coordinate with civil attorneys when their clients face both criminal and civil liability. What kind of plea agreement? I asked. That depends on what federal prosecutors are willing to offer, Nina said. But Julian's facing decades in prison if convicted on all charges. Decades? I repeated. Financial crimes carry serious penalties, Nina said, especially when they involve offshore accounts and systematic deception. So he might be willing to cooperate? I asked. He might be willing to negotiate, Nina said. But cooperation would require admitting his crimes and providing information about his accomplices. What kind of information? I asked. Names, methods, financial structures, Nina said. The kind of information that could lead to additional prosecutions of people who helped him. I asked. Of people who might be running similar schemes. Nina said. Financial crimes networks often involve multiple participants. What does that mean for me? I asked. It means your evidence might be used in cases beyond Julian's prosecution, Nina said. But it also means you might receive additional protection as a witness. What kind of protection? I asked. Federal witness protection for cases involving organized financial crimes, Nina said, which provides more comprehensive security than standard witness protection. For how long? I asked. Until all related cases are resolved, Nina said, which could be several years. Several years, I repeated. Complex financial crimes cases often generate multiple prosecutions, Nina said. But the protection is comprehensive. What does comprehensive mean? I asked. Security measures, relocation assistance, financial support, Nina said. The kind of protection that allows witnesses to rebuild their lives safely. What about Lena? I asked. She would be protected as well, Nina said. But these are decisions that don't need to be made immediately. When do they need to be made? I asked. After we see how Julian responds to the charges, Nina said, and after we understand the scope of the investigation. The next morning, Agent Rivera called with news that would change everything. Julian's lawyer has indicated he might be willing to cooperate, he said. We're meeting with them this afternoon to discuss terms. What kind of terms? I asked. Complete cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence, Agent Rivera said. But the cooperation would need to be substantial. How substantial? I asked. Full disclosure of his methods, identification of all accomplices, and testimony against co-conspirators, Agent Rivera said. The kind of cooperation that could lead to additional prosecutions. What would that mean for me? I asked. It would mean faster resolution of your case, Agent Rivera said, and potentially more comprehensive asset recovery. How much faster? I asked. Months instead of years, Agent Rivera said. But it would also mean Julian admitting publicly to the crimes he committed against you. Publicly? I asked. Court proceedings are public record, Agent Rivera said. If Julian cooperates, his admissions would be documented in court filings. What about my privacy? I asked. Your identity as a victim would be public, Agent Rivera said. But your personal information would be protected. What do you think I should do? I asked. I think you should consider what serves your long-term interests, Agent Rivera said. Cooperation could expedite the process and lead to better outcomes for you and your daughter. What kind of outcomes? I asked. Asset recovery, closure, and the knowledge that Julian's cooperation might help protect other potential victims. Agent Rivera said, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about preventing future crimes. Then I support whatever leads to the best outcome, I said. For me, for Lena, and for anyone else who might be victimized by people like Julian. That's exactly the kind of perspective that makes someone effective at fighting financial crimes, Agent Rivera said. Have you considered what you want to do professionally after this case is resolved? I haven't had time to think about the future, I said. You should, Agent Rivera said, because your expertise and your experience could be valuable in helping other people in similar situations. What do you mean? I asked. I mean that federal agencies and private firms are always looking for people with your combination of skills and integrity, Agent Rivera said. People who understand both the technical aspects of financial crimes and the personal impact on victims. You think I should work in law enforcement? I asked. I think you 6 months after Julian's arrest, I stood in the family court where our divorce case would finally be resolved. The federal criminal case had concluded with Julian's sentencing to 12 years in prison, complete asset forfeiture, and a cooperation agreement that had led to the prosecution of 7 other defendants in his financial crimes network. Now, the civil proceedings would determine the final division of our assets and, more importantly, the custody arrangements for Lena. The courtroom felt different from the federal courthouse, where I'd watched Julian plead guilty to multiple felonies. This was a smaller space, designed for family disputes rather than criminal proceedings, but the stakes felt just as high. Nina sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, her briefcase filled with documentation that would support our case for sole custody and full asset recovery. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice carrying the confidence that had made her successful at handling complex divorce cases. "I'm ready," I said, though I wasn't sure I was prepared for the emotional impact of facing Julian again, even in a civil proceeding. Julian entered the courtroom wearing a different orange jumpsuit, escorted by federal marshals who would return him to prison after the hearing. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by months of incarceration and the complete destruction of the life he'd built through systematic deception. His lawyer, a court-appointed attorney named David Rodriguez, had the weary expression of someone handling a case with no good options. Rebecca Chen had withdrawn from his representation after the criminal case concluded, citing conflicts of interest that probably had more to do with unpaid fees than ethical concerns. "Your Honor," Nina began, when called upon to present our case, "this divorce involves more than the typical division of marital assets. The defendant has been convicted of federal crimes that involve the systematic theft of money from joint accounts, the concealment of assets through fraudulent business entities, and the planned abandonment of his family during a medical crisis. I've reviewed the federal court documents," Judge Patricia Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd presided over thousands of family law cases. "The criminal conviction is certainly relevant to asset division and custody determinations, Your Honor," Nina continued. "The defendant's crimes demonstrate a complete disregard for his obligations to his spouse and daughter. He stole money while my client was hospitalized, planned to flee the country without regard for his daughter's well-being, and systematically deceived his family about his financial activities for over 2 years. What is the current status of asset recovery?" Judge Williams asked. "The federal government has recovered approximately $280,000 in liquid assets," Nina said, "plus the family residence, which was not part of the criminal scheme. The defendant has also agreed to restitution payments from any future earnings. What about custody?" Judge Williams asked. "My client seeks sole legal and physical custody," Nina said. "The defendant's criminal behavior, his planned abandonment of his family, and his current incarceration make him unsuitable for shared custody arrangements." "Mr. Rodriguez?" Judge Williams asked, turning to Julian's attorney. "Your Honor," David Rodriguez said, "my client acknowledges his crimes and accepts responsibility for his actions. However, he loves his daughter and hopes to maintain some relationship with her, even under the current circumstances." "Mr. Ward," Judge Williams said, addressing Julian directly, "you have the right to speak on your own behalf. Do you wish to make a statement?" Julian stood slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he prepared to speak. I watched his face, looking for signs of the man I'd been married to for 12 years, but all I saw was someone who'd been broken by the consequences of his own choices. "Your Honor," Julian said, his voice hoarse from months of limited use, "I know I can't undo what I've done. I stole from my wife, I betrayed my family, and I planned to abandon my daughter when she needed me most." He paused, seeming to gather strength for what came next. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he continued, "but I want Lena to know that I love her, even though I've destroyed any right to be part of her life. I want her to know that my crimes were about my own weakness and greed, not about anything she did wrong." "Do you contest the custody arrangement?" Judge Williams asked. "No, Your Honor," Julian said. "Ava is a wonderful mother, and Lena will be better off with her. I just hope that someday, when Lena is older, she might be willing to have some contact with me." "What about asset division?" Judge Williams asked. "I agree to whatever the court decides," Julian said. "I have no right to any of the money I stole, and I want Ava to have everything she needs to take care of Lena." I listened to Julian's statement with mixed emotions. Part of me felt satisfaction that he was finally accepting responsibility for his actions, but another part of me felt sadness for the family we'd been before his crimes destroyed everything. Your Honor, Nina said, while we appreciate the defendant's acknowledgement of his crimes, we believe his actions demonstrate a fundamental inability to prioritize his family's well-being over his own interests. I agree, Judge Williams said. Mr. Ward, your criminal behavior has demonstrated a complete disregard for your obligations as a husband and father. The court grants sole legal and physical custody to Miss Moreno, with supervised visitation to be determined based on your future conduct and your daughter's wishes. What about the assets? Nina asked. All recovered assets are awarded to Miss Moreno, Judge Williams said. Mr. Ward forfeits any claim to marital property, and he is ordered to pay restitution for any assets that cannot be recovered. What about ongoing support? Nina asked. Given Mr. Ward's incarceration and the criminal nature of his financial activities, no spousal support is ordered, Judge Williams said. Child support will be determined based on his future earning capacity, if any. Your Honor, I said, standing to address the court. May I make a statement? You may, Judge Williams said. I want to thank the court for recognizing the impact of Julian's crimes on our family, I said. But I also want to say that this case has taught me something important about justice and moving forward. What is that? Judge Williams asked. That justice isn't just about punishment, I said. It's about ensuring that victims have the resources and support they need to rebuild their lives, and that criminals face consequences that might prevent them from hurting other people. That's a mature perspective, Judge Williams said. How do you plan to move forward? I'm going to use the skills I've developed through this experience to help other victims of financial crimes, I said. I've accepted a position with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, where I'll work on cases involving complex financial fraud. That seems like a positive outcome from a difficult situation, Judge Williams said. Is there anything else you'd like to say? I want Lena to know that she's not responsible for her father's choices, I said. And I want her to understand that we survived something terrible and came out stronger. Where is your daughter today? Judge Williams asked. She's at school, I said. She knows about the hearing, but she didn't want to attend. She's more interested in moving forward than in looking back. That's probably healthy, Judge Williams said. Mr. Ward, do you have anything else you'd like to say? Just that I'm sorry, Julian said. To Ava, to Lena, and to anyone else who was hurt by my actions. I know sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have. The court accepts your apology, Judge Williams said, but the consequences of your actions will continue long after this hearing. The divorce is granted, with the asset division and custody arrangements as stated, as Julian was led away by the federal marshals. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the legal proceedings were finally over. Sadness for the family we'd once been, but also hope for the future Lena and I would build together. How do you feel? Nina asked as we gathered our papers. I feel like I can finally move forward, I said. For the first time in months, I'm not waiting for the next legal proceeding or the next revelation about Julian's crimes. What's next? She asked. Lena and I are moving to a new house next month, I said. Closer to my new job, and far enough away from our old neighborhood that we can start fresh. What about Julian? She asked. He'll serve his sentence, I said. And maybe someday, if Lena wants to have contact with him, we'll figure out how to make that work safely. Do you think she'll want that? Nina asked. I don't know, I said. She's 11 years old, and she's been through a lot. I think she needs time to process everything that's happened before she makes decisions about her relationship with her father. That's wise, Nina said. What about you? Do you think you'll ever forgive him? I think I've already started, I said. Not because he deserves forgiveness, but because carrying anger and resentment would prevent me from moving forward. That's remarkable, Nina said. Most people in your situation would be focused on revenge. Revenge wouldn't help Lena, I said. And it wouldn't help the other victims of financial crimes that I'm going to work with in my new job. What kind of work will you be doing? Nina asked. Investigating complex financial fraud cases, I said. Working with victims to document their losses and recover their assets. Helping people who've been through experiences similar to what I've been through. That sounds like meaningful work, Nina said. It feels like the right way to use everything I've learned, I said. Julian's crimes taught me things about financial investigations that I never would have learned otherwise. Now I can use those skills to help other people. What about Lena? Nina asked. How is she handling everything? She's resilient, I said. She understands that her father made bad choices, but she also understands that those choices don't define her or determine her future. What does she want to do? Nina asked. She wants to focus on school and her friends, I said. She wants to have a normal life, which is exactly what I want for her. Will you tell her about the hearing? Nina asked. I'll tell her that the divorce is final and that we're moving forward, I said. She doesn't need to know all the details, but she deserves to know that the legal proceedings are over. What about the money? Nina asked. It's more than enough to give Lena a good life, I said. College, opportunities, security. The things that Julian's crimes could have taken away from her. Are you satisfied with the outcome? Nina asked. I'm satisfied that justice was done, I said. Julian faced serious consequences for his crimes, other victims were protected, and Lena and I have the resources we need to rebuild our lives. What would you tell other people in similar situations? Nina asked. I would tell them that fighting back is worth it, I said, even when it's difficult and scary, even when the legal process seems overwhelming. The truth has power, and people who are willing to pursue the truth can achieve justice. Any regrets? Nina asked. I regret that Lena had to go through this, I said, but I don't regret investigating Julian's crimes or cooperating with federal authorities. Those decisions led to justice, and they're going to help other people avoid similar situations. What about Julian? Nina asked. Any regrets about what happened to him? I regret the choices he made, I said, but I don't regret the consequences he's facing. He did this to himself and to his family. The consequences are appropriate. What's your advice for other victims of financial crimes? Nina asked. Document everything, I said. Trust your instincts. Get professional help from people who understand complex financial investigations. And don't be afraid to involve federal authorities if the crimes are serious enough. What about the emotional aspects? Nina asked. The emotional aspects are the hardest part, I said, but they get easier with time, especially when you're focused on moving forward rather than looking back. What's your biggest takeaway from this experience? Nina asked. That I'm stronger than I thought I was, I said, and that terrible experiences can lead to positive outcomes if you're willing to fight for justice. Thank you, Nina said, for letting me be part of your case and for showing me what courage looks like. Thank you for helping me fight back, I said. I couldn't have done this without you. As I left the courthouse, I felt a sense of completion that I'd been waiting for since Julian's arrest. The legal proceedings were over, the assets were recovered, and Lena and I were free to move forward with our lives, but I also felt something else, gratitude for the experience that had taught me so much about my own capabilities and about the importance of fighting for justice. Julian's crimes had been devastating, but they'd also revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed. 2 months later, I stood in my new office at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, looking out at the San Diego skyline through windows that faced east toward the future rather than west toward the past. The office was smaller than what I'd had in private practice, but it felt more significant because the work I was doing here would help protect people from the kind of systematic financial betrayal I'd experienced. How are you settling in? Agent Rivera asked, appearing in my doorway with a cup of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully recruited a valuable team member. It feels right, I said, gesturing toward the case files spread across my desk. Complex financial crimes that need careful investigation. Victims who need help recovering their assets. The kind of work that makes a difference. What's your first case? He asked. A tech executive who's been embezzling from employee pension funds, I said. The methods are similar to what Julian used, but the scale is much larger. How much larger? Agent Rivera asked. Potentially $5 million, I said. With over 300 victims, that's substantial, Agent Rivera said. What's your approach? Start with the financial records, I said. Follow the money through whatever shell companies and offshore accounts he's created. Document everything carefully so we can build a strong case. Sounds familiar, Agent Rivera said with a smile. The techniques are similar, I said, but the perspective is different. I'm not just investigating crimes now. I'm helping people who've been victimized by financial fraud. How does that feel? Agent Rivera asked. It feels like the right use of everything I learned, I said. Julian's crimes taught me things about financial investigations that I never would have learned otherwise. Now I can use those skills to help other people. What about Lena? Agent Rivera asked. How is she adjusting to the new situation? She's thriving, I said. New school, new friends, new opportunities. She's focused on the future rather than the past. Does she ask about her father? Agent Rivera asked. Sometimes, I said, but she's more interested in her own life than in his situation. She understands that he made bad choices, but she also understands that those choices don't define her. That's healthy, Agent Rivera said. What about you? Do you think about Julian? I think about the case, I said, about what I learned from investigating his crimes, but I don't think about him personally very often. No anger? Agent Rivera asked. Less anger than I expected, I said. I think working on other cases has helped me see Julian's crimes as part of a larger pattern rather than as a personal attack. What kind of pattern? Agent Rivera asked. People who prioritize their own interests over their obligations to others. I said. People who think they're smart enough to avoid consequences for their actions. Are they? Agent Rivera asked. Usually not, I said. Financial crimes leave paper trails, and people who investigate those trails professionally are good at following them. People like you, Agent Rivera said. People like me, I agreed. And like the other investigators in this office who work on these cases every day. What's your long-term goal? Agent Rivera asked. To help as many victims as possible, I said. To recover as much stolen money as possible. To ensure that people who commit financial crimes face appropriate consequences. What about personal goals? Agent Rivera asked. To give Lena a good life, I said. To build a career that makes a difference. To use my experience to help other people who've been through similar situations. Any thoughts about dating? Agent Rivera asked. Moving on personally? Not yet, I said. I'm focused on rebuilding my life and doing meaningful work. Romance can wait until I'm ready to trust someone again. Fair enough, Agent Rivera said. But don't let Julian's crimes prevent you from finding happiness. They won't, I said. But they've taught me to be more careful about who I trust and what I'm willing to risk. What have you learned about trust? Agent Rivera asked. That it should be earned over time, I said. And that financial transparency is essential in any serious relationship. What about forgiveness? Agent Rivera asked. I've forgiven Julian, I said. Not because he deserves it, but because carrying resentment would prevent me from moving forward. Have you told him that? Agent Rivera asked. No, I said. And I don't plan to. My forgiveness is about my own healing, not about his redemption. What if he contacts you? Agent Rivera asked. He won't, I said. His cooperation agreement includes restrictions on contacting victims without court approval. But if he did? Agent Rivera asked. I would refer him to my attorney, I said. I've moved forward with my life, and I don't need to maintain any relationship with him. What about Lena? Agent Rivera asked. What if she wants to contact him? When she's older, if she wants to have contact with him, we'll figure out how to make that work safely, I said. But that's her decision to make when she's ready. How will you know when she's ready? Agent Rivera asked. I'll trust her judgment, I said. She's shown remarkable maturity throughout this process. What's the most important thing you've learned? Agent Rivera asked. That I'm stronger than I thought I was, I said. And that terrible experiences can lead to positive outcomes if you're willing to fight for justice. What would you tell other victims of financial crimes? Agent Rivera asked. That they're not alone, I said. That there are people who understand what they're going through and who can help them recover. What kind of help? Agent Rivera asked. Professional help with investigating the crimes, I said. Legal help with pursuing justice. Emotional help with processing the betrayal and moving forward. What about the financial aspects? Agent Rivera asked. That recovery is possible, I said. It might not be complete, and it might take time, but people who are willing to fight for their rights can often recover significant portions of what was stolen. What's your success rate? Agent Rivera asked. Too early to say, I said. But I'm committed to pursuing every available option for asset recovery. What about prevention? Agent Rivera asked. Education is important, I said. People need to understand the warning signs of financial fraud and the importance of maintaining oversight of their financial accounts. What are the warning signs? Agent Rivera asked. Secrecy about financial activities, I said. Reluctance to discuss investments or business operations. Unexplained changes in spending patterns or asset values. What should people do if they suspect financial fraud? Agent Rivera asked. Document everything, I said. Keep records of all financial transactions. Take photographs of documents. Create timelines of suspicious activities. Then what? Agent Rivera asked. Get professional help, I said. Contact law enforcement if the crimes are serious enough to warrant prosecution. Work with attorneys who understand complex financial cases. What about the emotional aspects? Agent Rivera asked. Those are the hardest part, I said, but they get easier with time, especially when you're focused on helping other people rather than dwelling on your own situation. Is that why you took this job? Agent Rivera asked. Partly, I said, but also because I'm good at this work, and because it makes a difference in people's lives. What kind of difference? Agent Rivera asked. The difference between being a victim and being a survivor, I said. Between accepting financial fraud and fighting back against it. What's next for you? Agent Rivera asked. Building cases, I said. Helping victims. Ensuring that people who commit financial crimes face serious consequences. What about Lena? Agent Rivera asked. Lena is going to have a good life, I said. She's going to understand that her father's crimes don't define her, and that she has the power to make her own choices about her future. What kind of choices? Agent Rivera asked. Whatever she wants, I said. College, career, relationships. The kind of choices that are available to people who have financial security and emotional support. What about your relationship with her? Agent Rivera asked. It's stronger than it's ever been, I said. Going through this experience together has shown both of us that we can handle difficult situations and come out stronger. What would you tell her if she asked for advice about relationships? Agent Rivera asked. I would tell her to trust her instincts, I said, to maintain her independence, to never let anyone control her access to financial information. What about love? Agent Rivera asked. Love should make you stronger, not more vulnerable, I said. It should be based on trust and transparency, not on control or deception. Do you think you'll find that kind of love? Agent Rivera asked. Maybe, I said, but I'm not looking for it right now. I'm focused on building a life that makes me proud, regardless of whether I share it with someone else. What makes you proud? Agent Rivera asked. The work I'm doing, I said. The way Lena has handled this situation. The fact that we survived something terrible and came out stronger. What about Julian? Agent Rivera asked. Are you proud of how you handled his crimes? I'm proud that I fought back, I said. I'm proud that I pursued justice even when it was difficult and scary. I'm proud that I helped protect other potential victims. Any regrets? Agent Rivera asked. I regret that Lena had to go through this, I said, but I don't regret the choices I made about how to respond to Julian's crimes. What's your advice for other people in similar situations? Agent Rivera asked. Fight back, I said. Don't let financial criminals get away with their crimes. Don't let them make you feel powerless or ashamed. What if they're scared? Agent Rivera asked. Fear is natural, I said. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear because justice is more important than comfort. What about the future? Agent Rivera asked. The future is full of possibilities, I said. For me, for Lena, and for all the victims of financial crimes who are going to get help recovering their assets and rebuilding their lives. What kind of possibilities? Agent Rivera asked. Justice, I said. Recovery. The knowledge that terrible experiences can lead to positive outcomes if you're willing to fight for what's right. That sounds like a good definition of success, Agent Rivera said. It's the only definition that matters, I said. Success isn't about avoiding difficult situations. It's about handling them with integrity and using them to help other people. What would you tell Julian if you saw him again? Agent Rivera asked. I would tell him that Lena is thriving, I said. That his crimes didn't destroy us. That we're stronger than he thought we were. What would you tell yourself a year ago? Agent Rivera asked. I would tell myself that I was going to discover strengths I didn't know I had, I said. That I was going to help other people in ways I'd never imagined. That the worst thing that happened to me was going to lead to some of the best things. What's the best thing? Agent Rivera asked. The work I'm doing now, I said. The relationship I have with Lena. The knowledge that I can handle whatever life throws at me. What about the recovered assets? Agent Rivera asked. The money is important, I said. But the most valuable thing I recovered was my sense of my own capabilities. What capabilities? Agent Rivera asked. The ability to investigate complex crimes, I said. The courage to pursue justice even when it's dangerous. The resilience to rebuild my life after systematic betrayal. Those are remarkable capabilities, Agent Rivera said. They're capabilities that everyone has, I said. But most people never discover them because they're never tested the way I was tested. What would you tell people who are currently being tested? Agent Rivera asked. That they're stronger than they think they are, I said. That justice is possible if they're willing to fight for it. That terrible experiences can lead to meaningful work and purposeful lives. What about happiness? Agent Rivera asked. I'm happy, I said. Not because my life is perfect, but because I'm doing work that matters and raising a daughter who's going to make a positive difference in the world. That sounds like the best possible outcome, Agent Rivera said. It's better than I could have imagined a year ago, I said. When I thought Julian's crimes were going to destroy everything I cared about. What did you learn about destruction? Agent Rivera asked. That it's usually the beginning of something new, I said. That people who try to destroy others often end up revealing their victims' hidden strengths. What's your message to other victims of financial crimes? Agent Rivera asked. That they can fight back, I said. That they can win. That they can use their experiences to help other people and to build lives they're proud of. What's your message to criminals who commit financial fraud? Agent Rivera asked. That they're not as smart as they think they are, I said. That their victims are stronger than they expect. That justice is patient, but it's also inevitable. What's next? Agent Rivera asked. More cases, I said. More victims to help. More criminals to investigate. More assets to recover. What about personally? Agent Rivera asked. Personally, I'm going to continue building a life that makes me proud, I said. A life that serves other people. And that shows Lena what's possible when you refuse to be defeated by other people's crimes. That sounds like a perfect ending, Agent Rivera said. It's not an ending, I said. It's a beginning. The beginning of whatever comes next. And as I turned back to the case files on my desk, I realized that Julian's attempt to destroy me had actually led to the discovery of my true purpose. He'd tried to hide money from me, but I'd exposed everything to the authorities. He'd tried to make me a victim, but I'd become someone who fights for other victims. That felt like the most perfect form of justice imaginable. Not just punishment for Julian, but transformation for me. Not just recovery of stolen assets, but discovery of capabilities I'd never known I possessed. The future was full of cases to investigate, victims to help, and criminals to bring to justice. And I was ready for all of it. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.